Hello everybody, Brad the Guitarologist here. In this video I thought I would talk about something I haven't touched upon before, and that is strings. If you'd like to learn more about strings, stick around. Okay, what I'd really like to touch upon as far as strings go are what I prefer in terms of strings and some general rules of thumb that everybody can kind of learn, and it'll give you more of an insight as to what gauges of strings to use in certain situations, etc. On electric guitars, if you play in standard tuning on a Fender guitar, I personally prefer 9-gauge strings, and the reason is with 9-gauge strings, they are just slinky enough with the 25.5-inch scale length that you can get bluesy bends, and you can not only get a full step bend, but you can get more than a full step bend. If you do a lot of that kind of stuff, you can suffer from a lot of finger fatigue. Your calluses can kind of suffer as a result of overbending, and it's harder for you to play longer periods of time if you have really heavy strings. On a shorter Gibson scale, however, on a 24 3/4 inch scale, you're going to need a thicker string in order to get the same tension on all your strings. So I like to personally use 10-gauge strings on anything with a Gibson scale, and usually I think that's what they ship with as well. With acoustic guitars, the same rules apply. The less slinky it is, the more you're able to bend, the more bluesy licks you're able to do, but you also lose energy. If you go with a slinkier, thinner gauge of string, you are not going to get the same amount of energy out of those strings into the top of the guitar as you would with a thicker gauge of string, but it's a trade-off. With a thicker gauge of string, you're actually stressing the guitar more, particularly on an acoustic, because the top is so thin, and of course the bracing system is there to counteract this upward pull of the strings on the top. But over time, as you know, if you've ever gotten a vintage guitar and it's had a severe belly in it or a severe bulge around the bridge, that this can be a real problem. And structurally, acoustic guitars are always on the razor thin edge of total destruction and immaculate tone. That is the beauty of an acoustic guitar. You have these two forces of freedom of movement versus structural stability constantly at odds with one another. And although thicker strings will give you a boomier, more bassy tone with more sustain, they can also stress a guitar's top. And you'll want to balance what you do with your guitar. Say if you're in a recording session and you want to get the most tone out of your fine acoustic guitar, maybe perhaps slap a slightly thicker gauge like a 13-gauge. Most string manufacturers classify it as a medium gauge. I wouldn't go really much beyond a 13 on a nice higher end acoustic guitar. You're just gonna probably risk damage. But a 13 will give you a nice, full, robust tone, particularly on dreadnoughts, J45 type Gibsons with slope shoulders, and especially on jumbos. 13-gauge strings are going to give you a lot of boom, a lot of punch, a lot of that mid-range punch as well, where if you're a strummer, your strings are going to be less likely to buzz, so you can set your action actually a little bit lower if you have a heavier gauge string, and this is part of the trade-off as well. So these are all things that interact with one another and you have to consider, but there's a science behind all of it. Generally speaking, the thicker a gauge string, the more sustain you're going to get, and the reason you're going to get more sustain is because there's more mass in the string and more inertia. An object in motion tends to stay in motion. So if you put a string into motion that's a heavier string than the other one you put into motion that's a slightly lighter string, which one is going to sustain longer? It's going to be the heavier string because it has more inertia. Yes, there are people who play really extremely slinky, extremely light gauge strings like Billy Gibbons. He's the example that a lot of people throw out there because he plays like 7s or 8-gauge strings. 7s and 8s are a really thin gauge string, and unless you have really hot pickups on your electric guitar, you're probably not going to be getting the most sound out of it. And your sustain is also going to suffer as well. You don't really hear Billy Gibbons, for instance, hitting big long chords and letting them sustain like, say, Pete Townshend. No, Billy Gibbons does more bendy, bluesy type licks. He does a lot of pinch harmonics and things like that, and those thinner gauge strings are fine for that style of playing. Likewise, if you go with too heavy of a gauge of string, like if you start putting 11s, 12s, or even 13s on your electric guitar, you better be tuning the thing down to accommodate for that high tension, or it's going to be virtually unplayable. So to recap, higher gauge strings means more sustain because of more inertia. Slinkier strings means they're easier to play, you can play longer, and your calluses won't suffer. And on acoustic guitars, you really need to consider the stress on the top of the guitar when you're considering which gauge of string to use. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Please hit subscribe down below and hit the bell to get all notifications. And for now, y'all take care.